What's this? A new backdrop that looks like an old school video store from the 80s and 90s? Kinda fits me better, don't you think? I mean, when I'm not clipping VTubers, I am a nostalgia bait ping tuber. But wait, where am I? Here I am. New avatar created with Gemini. And that's not the only change I have in store this podcast episode. For instance, also created with Gemini. Hello, wonderful listeners, and welcome back to One Lone Cat Podcast. I'm Blackcat Loner. Well, 1 minute life shit happens, and the next thing you know, it's 2026. In the meantime, I've got a show for you this week. In addition, I'm going to do something I haven't done in a while. A binge watch. And like Strange New Worlds, Seth MacFarlane made us wait 2 years for the second season of this show. And since it debuted early in March, and since both seasons combined have a total of 15 episodes, I'm going to do a binge watch on both seasons of Ted. And now it's time for another binge watch. And since the first binge watch of part 1 of Cobra Kai season 6 was so well received, it's long overdue time to start the next one. And this time we're going to be talking about Seth MacFarlane's new live action show, Ted, which streams on Peacock, NBC's streaming site. The Ted series is a prequel to the 2 Ted movies that were released in 2012 and 2015, respectively, and centers around the adventures of John Bennett, who was played by Mark Wahlberg in the movies, and his pot-smoking, irreverent talking teddy bear named Ted, voiced by Seth MacFarlane, using his Peter Griffin voice. The series focused on John and Ted's high school years during the 90s, where we find out where Ted and John smoke pot for the first time they watch Korn, and the first time John tries to get laid. Upon its release in January 2024, Ted became one of the most watched original series on Peacock, and was so well received that Season 2 was greenlit, and despite Seth going the Strange New Worlds route and making us wait 2 years for it, Season 2 was finally released in March, to even wider acclaim. Will there be a Season 3? Well, here's the thing. We almost didn't get Season 2 because of production costs. And at one point, a cartoon series was considered instead. Guys, a cartoon series of Ted already exists. It's called Family Guy. Besides, Ted works better as live action. And also, $8 million an episode really isn't that bad. As I mentioned during episode 3 of One Lone Cat Podcast, I first watched season 1 of Ted when I was recovering from my hospital visit where I had foot surgery done back in February of 2024, and the show was truly hilarious. Been waiting to do this as a binge watch for a while, but after the Cobra Kai episode, I decided to give it a go. And since there are only 15 episodes between the 2 seasons, I figure I'd do both seasons in one go. So without further ado, on with the show. Episode 1, Just Say Yes. The nearly hour-long premiere episode begins with narration from Sir Ian McKellen, who took over for Patrick Stewart, who narrated the movies, followed by the Oscar-nominated theme song from the first movie, Everybody Needs a Best Friend, by Norah Jones, before it cuts to the Bennett household in a suburb of Boston in 1993. In addition to Ted and John, we meet their parents, Maddie and Susan. Maddie is kind of a 90s version of Archie Bunker with more profanity, while Susan is a bit more reserved and a bit prudish, meaning she won't use profanity despite Ted's frequent attempts to get her to do so. And rounding out the family is cousin Blair, who is staying with the Bennetts while in college, and is very liberal, making her a foil for Maddie. We'll learn a little more about Blair in this episode. This episode is basically about Ted's first day of school, which ironically was also around the time your friendly neighborhood Blackcat Loner started out as a freshman in high school. But unlike me, Ted is going to school as punishment after a few too many shenanigans when he's left home alone. Once he gets to school, Ted vows to get himself expelled, which turns out to be more difficult than he thought. For example, Ted calls out his one teacher, who happens to be a bit unhinged by saying his wife is cheating on him. But rather than being sent to the principal's office, the teacher actually admits that he's being cucked by his wife. Well, actually, a quick question. Is any one of those guys your wife is cheating on you with named Paul? And also my favorite, he actually hides out in the hot dog tub during lunch period, which actually does get him sent to the principal's office. After all those failed attempts, Ted gets tipped off by a hot girl named Sheila to a place where he can get some pot. Well, Ted learns that the school has a zero-tolerance policy, which is why he decides that getting pot is a good idea to help get him expelled. However, as it turns out, Sheila's dealer turns out to be Blair. Well, apparently she's dealing pot so she can pay her rent to Maddie. And of course she suspects right away that Ted is buying the pot for John. Well, she's half right. But she relents to selling Ted the pot because Ted actually convinces her that the pot is actually for him and not Johnny. And sure enough, Ted and John smoke pot for the first time. And it's pretty funny how they dress up in their Sunday finest and pray before they blaze up, and then strutting downstairs to the George Lopez theme song. Noticing that John and Ted have bigger appetites than usual, Blair confronts Ted and tells them not to tell their parents where they got the pot. John and Ted go back to school the next day with the pot, but they end up having the pot stolen by the school bully, Clive, therefore resulting in Ted being stuck in high school indefinitely. Of course, later on they raid Blair's room, but they get caught by Blair and Susan, causing the former to admit to dealing pot. That in turn results in Maddie evicting Blair from the house. John and Ted feel guilty afterwards and attempt to get Maddie to reconsider his decision by bribing him with the original mouthpiece worn by Sylvester Stallone in the original Rocky movie. And since Maddie's a diehard Rocky fan, he relents and Blair is allowed back. And while Ted and John promise to never do drugs, they continue to do pot. The episode also sets up Easter eggs from the first movie, such as Ted and John's love of Flash Gordon, the movie, and the fact that Ted invites sex workers to the house after accidentally shooting out the TV screen, which is what gets him sent to high school in the first place. Wait, isn't Ted a minor in this? There's also some nostalgic Easter eggs that Seth MacFarlane is famous for. For example, the episode began with John and Ted blowing on the back of a Nintendo cartridge just to get it to work. Spoiler alert, they upgrade to Super Nintendo later in the season, which also happened to me around the same time. But anyway, this show's off to a good start. Next up is episode 2, My Two Dads. First up, thanks for reminding me that show exists. But anyway, the plot for this episode deals with John and Ted being tormented by the school bully, Clive. But instead of fighting, Ted and John decide to exact revenge through Jerky Boys-style prank calls, leading Clive to believe that a mercenary is his long-lost father. The prank goes surprisingly well until they are forced to produce the dad at Clive's birthday party, which they do when they are caught trying to steal a Sega Genesis for a present by a mall cop who reveals himself to be an aspiring actor and agrees to appear as Clive's dad at his birthday party. Even though Clive eventually sees through their ruse, John and Ted are able to convince their bully that they were the ones rooting for him all along. And the B plot involves Maddie getting a colonoscopy, and he brings Blair with him and has her hide under the stretcher to witness any wrongdoings. And we also get a little glimpse into Maddie's backstory in Nam. All around a great episode with a good degree of heart. Next up, episode 3, Ejectile Dysfunction. A major milestone. John wants to watch his first Korn movie. This was back in the day where they kept said movies in a back room in a video store behind a black curtain to keep the under 18 peeps like John and Ted out. They use fake IDs to rent multiple tapes, but one gets stuck in the VCR. They sneak into the school AV room to swap VCRs, but Susan finds the original tape first and thinks that Maddie would rather watch that than be with her, especially since their anniversary date night didn't go very well. Blair ultimately takes the heat for the Korn video and convinces John and Ted to come back home and promise not to watch Korn again. Well, we all know how that turns out. For more details, see Ted 2. Episode 4, Subways, Bicycles, and Automobiles, which is a play on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. But while Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is the Thanksgiving movie, this is a Halloween episode. Blair forces Ted to be her designated driver for a Halloween party because she doesn't trust anybody else, which of course interrupts Ted and John's plans to bomb trick-or-treaters with eggs. Blair, dressed as Catwoman from Batman Returns, and Ted, dressed as an Ewok, goes to the party where it doesn't take long for Ted to get drunk too. This results in a truly wild and progressively weirder odyssey as a drunken Ted crashes her car, and they have to find their way home while encountering strange people and situations on the streets of Boston. Meanwhile, Susan invites a creepy older man who she mistakes to be the son of a friend of hers from church over to hang out with John. But at the same time, Blair and Ted get picked up by one of Blair's professors. At first, Ted thinks Blair's professor has some dubious intentions in store for her. But surprise, surprise, he's a furry! And he wants to hook up with Ted! However, Blair saves the day and they commandeer the professor's bicycle for an obligatory E.T. reference, only to get bombed by Johnny with ostrich eggs, which he got from Maddie, who received them as compensation for getting bitten by an ostrich at work. So a fun episode, which also exposes the myth over how hot McDonald's apple pies back then can be. Next up is episode 5, Desperately Seeking Susan. Title is a nod to Madonna's first full-length movie. Recognizing that Maddie and Susan's marriage is a disaster, Blair suggests marriage counseling. But when Maddie storms out on a professional, Ted is asked to step in as the therapist. Meanwhile, remember that teacher that was getting cucked by his wife in the first episode? Well, Aaron, basically your stereotypical cheerleader mean girl type, drives him to a mental breakdown and he ends up getting fired. This later leads to Susan wanting to be a substitute teacher, and she agrees to teach John and Ted's class. Of course, Aaron tries to roast Susan, but in a clip that literally sold the series, Ted savagely destroys her in front of the entire class. And by destroys, I mean he's saying things like talking about her nose job and how her father's really her uncle and all that stuff. And that forces Aaron to leave the class in tears, and Susan goes out and comforts her. Despite having a positive experience as a substitute teacher, Susan soon realizes that she truly belongs at home being a homemaker, and she quits being a substitute teacher. But yeah, like I said before, that scene that sold the series, this episode was pretty good. And now we have episode 6, Loud Night. Of all the episodes to make divisive, why did it have to be the Christmas episode? This is a Maddie and Blair episode, which begins with Maddie objecting to Blair bringing her friend Sarah, who's also her drug-dealing partner, over to the Bennetts for Christmas. He also decides to skip Susan's solo at the annual Christmas service at their local church to watch football, which doesn't sit too well with the rest of the family. Feeling like no one takes his side in an argument, Maddie makes an unorthodox wish that completely upends the Bennett family dynamic, where he brings his childhood dump truck named Dennis to life, in pretty much the same way that John brought Ted to life years earlier, and Dennis is also voiced by Seth MacFarlane. We also get the big reveal that cousin Blair is sexually fluid, and it is revealed that she is dating Sarah, which doesn't sit too well with Maddie's conservative views. And Dennis doesn't help things any. In fact, he instigates a lot of the arguments, which at one point nearly forces Blair to move out. However, Maddie soon realizes the error of his ways and apologizes to Blair, citing his upbringing for why he is the way he is. And the plot twist is, the dump truck is gay. Because you heard that cliche about conservatives who may or may not be in the closet? Yeah, and John and Ted's antics are basically relegated to the subplot, where Ted believes he's the second coming of Jesus. And so the Bennetts have a Merry Christmas. Maddie finally gets to hear Susan solo because he got her a karaoke machine. And the dump truck is last seen driving off into the sunset down the Mass Pike to a gay convention. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Which now brings us to the first season finale. He's gotta have it. John is obsessed with not being the only virgin left in high school before junior prom. While on a pot run, John meets Bethany, the younger sister of Sheila, the hot drug dealer, and they agree to go out on a date. Ted decides to quote-unquote help from planning an Aladdin-themed first date, which lands them both in the hospital where they are treated by Dr. Tuvok, and inflating John's reputation so much that Bethany dumps him. John has to abandon Ted's toxic advice, get honest with his crush Bethany, and try to win her back by announcing at the junior prom that he still has his V card. And of course, this happens.
Nerd!
Bethany agrees to take him back, and just as they're about to do it, the news breaks about the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase, ruining the mood, mirroring the story about his parents' first time being interrupted by Watergate. John and Ted end the season singing the Thunder Buddy song, as the coda tells us about O.J.'s acquittal and that the real killer was still at large. Spoiler alert, the real killer was the one that got off, and well, he eventually went to jail for something else. Olsen, he's dead now. I actually brought that up in the 4th episode of the podcast. Season 1 was raunchy, offensive, and surprisingly heartfelt. While Ted is at times a monster, his loyalty to John is real. It sets a high bar for comedy and a low bar for good taste. And the show proved to be just as successful as the movies. And now let's get to the new stuff. Season 2. This just dropped 2 years later. And I watched all 8 episodes. It picks up during the 1994-95 school year, John and Ted's senior year, college is on the horizon, and it was also my sophomore year in high school. And the duo are facing the realization that their perpetual adolescence might be coming to an end. This season felt a little tighter and gave the supporting cast, especially Maddie and Susan, much more to do. And of course, since this dropped last month, there will be spoilers! So here we go. In the season premiere episode, Talk Dirty to Me, John and Ted discover a phone in the school basement and use it to call a phone sex hotline, giving them an excuse to skip classes. Over the course of a couple of days, they rack up thousands of dollars in charges to the school. But however, the school soon catches wind of this, and then after blocking the number, the principal brings in a terrifying superintendent to find the culprits. At first watch, I actually thought that was Lawrence Fishburne that they got to play the superintendent, but it's actually somebody else. Looks like him though. While it looks like John and Ted have finally met their match, they managed to pull a Shawshank Redemption and invent a mysterious bad boy student, resulting in John pulling off an Evel Knievel stunt by jumping a bike over a couple of parked cars. And even though he's injured, the ploy works and the superintendent goes away. 2 years, definitely worth the wait. This is a great episode. Next episode is Mrs. Robotech, which begins with Maddie taking John and Ted on a landscaping job for the wealthy Robotech family. And the boys meet Mrs. Robotech, which is likely a spin on Mrs. Robinson from The Graduate. She's clearly a hot MILF, and as it turns out, she has an eye for Ted. When it comes time to collect the paycheck for Maddie, Mrs. Robotech specifically requests Ted to come over alone. And once he arrives, he's greeted at the door by a skimpily dressed Mrs. Robotech, who seduces him Mrs. Robinson style, and thus begins a risky affair that at one point involves Ted wearing a purple dildo. While Ted is busy getting busy, one person who's having difficulty in that department is Maddie, who due to his high stress is suffering from ED. But that doesn't stop Mr. Robocheck from paying Maddie a visit after getting his car's license plate after discovering his wife's affair and Ted narrowly escaping. He decides to be a cuck and offers Maddie thousands of dollars to watch him have sex with his wife, meaning Susan, to learn his secret. Of course, his ED kicks in and it doesn't work. As a result, Mrs. Robocheck ends the affair with Ted, which leaves him heartbroken as he laments over how he will never find another woman. And as he and John are driving away, Ted does a voiceover narration over how he was reunited with the purple dildo. And of course, the narration does set up his relationship with Tammy Lynn in the movies. Dungeons and Dealers, third episode of season 2, shows that of all the family bonding activities the Bennetts could do, it ends up being a D&D game. Just so John, Ted, and Blair can score some weed. And of course, none of them have played the game before. Hell, I've never played D&D. I just watch VTubers do it. This is also a highly imaginative episode, which takes place in the imaginary world of D&D, where the Bennetts are all dressed up as their respective characters in the game, while the guy they're trying to score weed off of is the Dungeon Master. And while Susan is supposed to be the knight character, she wins the game by basically being herself and being nice to the villain. A better D&D related show than Stranger Things Season 5. Next up, we got the Moms Bombed rom-com, where Blair breaks up with her girlfriend Sarah and just wants to sit around the house and watch rom-coms all day. Maddie, of course, gets frustrated by her sadness, but after an argument with Susan, which drives her to get drunk on wine, he also becomes addicted to Blair's rom-coms, like Pretty Woman, Ghost. And at one point, when Blair finally goes to bed, Maddie sneaks back into the living room and pops in Ghost. He also cries when Julia Roberts dies in Steel Magnolias. And like the Christmas episode last season, Johnny and Ted's shenanigans are relegated to the subplot, where Ted lies to John about hooking up with their elderly neighbor, leading the boys on a truly bizarre double date. And of course, things don't go as planned. Next up is The Sword and the Stoner, where John is short on extracurricular activities, which is a requirement for college. So he and Ted try out for the school play. And they have good reason to audition, and it's not just to get into college. As you know, poor Johnny still hasn't lost his V-card. Nerd! And realizes that he would be co-starring with the most popular girl in school, Erin, who was also the mean girl Ted roasted last season. Remember, that was the clip that sold the series to Peacock. They audition for the play, Ted using the Gummy Bears theme as his audition tape, and they wind up getting non-speaking roles as medieval guards. While our heroes are trying to get their name in lights, Maddie and Susan end up getting jobs at Dunkin' Donuts, now called Dunkin' in 2026, where they learn that the President of the United States will be visiting their store. Maddie is initially thrilled to hear this because he sees his chance to finally tell him off in front of the world. And of course, the day comes and the Dunkin' store gets a visit from Seth MacFarlane, playing AI-generated Bill Clinton. And of course, old Billy Boy winds up humiliating Maddie. And as far as the play goes, it ends up being a disaster. Even though John ends up striking out with Erin, he does succeed at getting an extracurricular activity added to his college application. While the idea to make Bill Clinton AI instead of just putting Seth MacFarlane in a wig and making him up to look like Bill Clinton is a little jarring, this is still a fun episode. And the episode that has the most potential to be the most divisive episode this season, but really isn't, is Season 2, Episode 6, Roe vs. Weed. Which means, yes kids, we're going to be talking about abortion! And yes, it's a Blair episode. The episode begins where Blair discovers she's pregnant after a one-night stand with a guy that happens off-screen. Remember, she's gender fluid. In the mid-90s, this wasn't just a personal crisis, it was a family explosion. The reactions are exactly what you would expect from the Bennett house. Maddie, of course, immediately jumps to shotgun wedding mode because he's obsessed with doing the right thing, even if it's for the wrong reasons. At one point, he even kidnaps Blair's resident advisor, an Indian guy who turns out to be conservative, and also not the guy Blair hooked up with. It was another random resident advisor from another section of the college who happens to be, the typical bad boy. And then, of course, Susan's reaction is her Catholic guilt starts kicking in, and she's torn between that and her love for Blair. And Blair, of course, wants to handle her business and finish school, but she's trapped in a house that treats her life like a debate club. And this is where the Ted humor balances out the heavy drama. John and Ted want to support Blair, but they're John and Ted. To help her get into the clinic past a group of angry protesters, John and Ted devise a plan that is peak Seth MacFarlane. They dress up as abortion machine repairmen, where they show up with a toolbox and a completely nonsensical backstory. And it's a perfect satire of how little the pro-life protesters protesting actually know about the medical procedures they're fighting against. And of course, John and Ted end up getting the shit beat out of them by the protesters. Ted has his ear ripped off and his eye is hanging out, but their hearts were mostly in the right place. And it was a distraction so Blair could get into the clinic without being harassed. The real emotional MVP of this episode isn't Ted or John, it's Susan. This episode starts a major arc for her where she realizes that she's the essential glue holding the crumbling family together. And while Maddie is yelling and the boys are being idiots, Susan has to reconcile her faith with her empathy for the girl she views as a daughter. It's a surprisingly grounded performance in a show that features a CGI bear getting high. The episode title, Roe vs. Weed, isn't just a pun. It represents the clash between the serious legal/moral battles of the era and the slacker lifestyle John and Ted lead that often blinds them to the stakes. Most comedies would trip over themselves trying to handle a topic like this, but Ted pulls it off because it never stops being itself. It uses the filthy humor to lower your guard so the emotional beats can actually land. Oh, and that creepy guy that John was forced to hang out with in the Halloween episode last season, he makes an appearance again where he answers the door and we see full frontal nudity. Yes, you can see his junk. Next up, Season 2, Episode 7. Susan is the new black. Because, orange is the new black. We spent 2 seasons watching Susan Bennett be the ultimate doormat for her family. But in episode 7, Susan is the new black, the mouse finally roars. Well, not quite. This time she brings her innocent naivete to a new forum. Jail. In this episode, when she's pulled over by a cop who finds John and Ted's newly bought stash of weed, Susan takes the fall for them and gets arrested. Since this is her first offense, she gets 10 days in jail. During Susan's stint in jail, Johnny and Ted are forced to do housework since it was their fault Susan went to jail. Well, of course, they can't cook for shit, they can't clean, and Maddie definitely can't shop. Meanwhile, Susan is bringing her domestic flair to the big house. From cleaning her cellmate's cell to working in the prison's kitchen, cooking better food. And of course there's one inmate who wants to kill her, but that all changes when Susan gives everyone Easter baskets. Because Easter happens that episode. Well, another fun episode that shows how much everyone took Susan for granted and that any place can be made to look like home. Even a dark place like jail. And finally, let's talk about the Ted Season 2 finale. Fraudcast news. If you thought this household was chaotic before, try adding a life-threatening heart scare and the biggest trial of the century into the mix. This episode takes ignorance is bliss to a level that only a foul-mouthed teddy bear and a dysfunctional Boston family could achieve. The episode kicks off with Johnny and Ted coming home after graduating from high school before time jumping 4 months to around the time the OJ verdict dropped. Seth really loves his OJ jokes, doesn't he? Remember last season ended with the Bronco chase? Of course, there was the OJ joke in the Liam Neeson Naked Gun movie. So it's only fitting that this season ends with the OJ verdict. While yelling at Johnny and Ted for sitting around the house since graduation, Maddie, the king of high blood pressure, finally has a heart attack. Dr. Tuvok's orders: stay calm, no stress, no yelling, and absolutely no politics. For Maddie Bennett, that's basically a death sentence. But the real kicker? This is 1995. And while Maddie is supposed to be relaxing, the world is about to stop for the O.J. Simpson verdict. The family knows that if Maddie hears the news, his head and his heart will literally explode. This is where the episode gets brilliant. To save Maddie's life, John, Ted, Blair, and Susan decide to create a total media blackout. But you can't just turn off the TV in 1995. You have to replace it. Ted, Johnny, and Blair start sneaking into the high school and start mocking up fake newspapers and even filming their own news segments using the mall cop actor from last season to keep Maddie in an alternate reality where OJ was found guilty. Also, Maddie enjoys an original comic strip that Johnny and Ted created. Oh, and one little tangent quick. When the OJ verdict dropped, I was a junior in high school, and I was in study hall when someone came up and told my study hall teacher that my art teacher was watching the verdict in her class and said if anyone wanted to watch it, they were allowed to go downstairs and watch it. So of course, I went down and watched the verdict. A lot of us in the school, myself included, were expecting a guilty verdict. One person I knew, whenever OJ was mentioned, he would go, "Guilty! He's guilty!" So imagine my shock when I heard not guilty. I include an OJ verdict in my high school novel, Where Were You in '97? But in the meantime, that's my little story on where I was when the OJ verdict dropped. Now back to the show. It's when Maddie goes out into the world and is interviewed by a TV reporter about the verdict. He still doesn't know OJ was acquitted, until he goes to the bar where the family catches up to him and admit the truth that everything goes nuts. And of course, he has another heart attack. But in the meantime, when he recovers, Maddie praises Johnny and Ted for creating the comic strip and says that they can do anything if they put their minds to it. Which leads to the last scene of the season, where Johnny and Ted are seen walking towards the gym, which sets up Johnny eventually growing up to become Marky Mark in the movies, and Sir Ian McKellen pops up to narrate that last shot. And he gets meta by saying, well, you have to see the movies to see what happens next. Even though he does mention that he's going to get married, divorced, and meet another girl. So that was Ted the series. And it was fucking great. I loved it. If you like Seth MacFarlane's brand of humor, Family Guy, American Dad, The Orville, the Ted movies, you will love this show. It is packed with 90s pop culture references, crude jokes, and absurd gags, but also has a shocking amount of heart. The relationship between John and Ted is genuinely sweet, even when it's toxic. The supporting cast, especially Scott Grimes and Alana Ubach, are the unsung heroes of the show. Season 2 maintained the momentum that Season 1 started with. It felt slightly more mature for a show about a foul-mouthed bear, handling themes of growing up and changing dynamics while still being hilarious. And it's packed with Easter eggs that connects the show with the movies, and also allowed a certain friendly neighborhood Blackcat to relive his high school years, and also inspired him to write a book about it called Where Were You in '97, which again I'm pushing back to next year so I can get my '80s novel out. However, there's a heads up. Seth MacFarlane has stated that he does actually want to do a Season 3, and he also wants to do a movie. He's not sure which, but if he does the movie, he wants to have the cast from the show back rather than bring back Marky Mark. Because, you know, apparently making a CGI bear interact with live actors every single scene is kind of expensive. He describes it as doing a Marvel movie every half hour. So the Season 2 finale, while leaving the door a crack open, is kind of designed to be the definitive end of the prequel era. It's a bummer, but it's also fitting. We know where the story ends. We know they grow up to be Marky Mark and a bear who works at a grocery store. This was a fun, filthy detour into their teenage years. I highly recommend it. Just don't watch it with your parents or your kids or anyone with a weak stomach for penis and pot jokes. But other than that, it's great. Thunder Buddies for life.